We're in trouble if we forget our past, even our deep, deep past, centuries, millennium. To have heard in the first century Paul's letter to the Colossians, to have read the prologue of St. John, probably written round about 2/3 into the first century, a couple generations after Christ, would have been to have heard something awe-inspiringly radical. This was the message that would eventually shake an empire apart, and an evil one at that. In those days, life was hard. Average age was, well, you died at about 29. Large part of the population was held in slavery or bonded servitude. The economy was such that Rome took the wealth of many of its occupied countries. So life was cruel, hard. But worse still, and this particularly came into effect as the republic that had been around in the first century BC moved into the more megalomaniac totalitarian empire. Your sense of who you were as a person was greatly diminished. And that's perhaps really hard for us to get our heads around unless we've lived in a country not dissimilar to that in some ways, that has some of that overtones. You know, perhaps we might have grown up in Eastern Europe a generation ago, or experienced life in other parts of the world where there is little or no democracy, and felt the atmosphere and what it's like. At the time of Christ, and for at least 3-4 centuries afterwards, there was only one child of God, one son of God. There was only one way to be adopted into the divinity, and that was by being at the top of the pyramid, being the emperor. Octavian Augustus had declared his uncle Julius Caesar a god, and then himself a god. And the list of cranks and goofs that took on that role for those remaining centuries had many of them put up statues and temples of themselves. This was the official religion. You could believe in anything you want, have any god that you so believed, but you had to assert that the emperor was the Son of God. He was the image of all divinity. Now, aside from Judaism in the synagogues, which was tolerated on and off, one movement, one body of small believers took a completely different stance, and in doing so put their neck out. Many were seen as, strange as might seem ironic, but were called atheists for not believing in the cult of the emperor. And these are the Christians. So you have to remember that to believe in the cult of the emperor was to hold not only that Caesar, in whatever incarnation he was at the time, was a divinity, but that everyone else were the pawns of the god. Everybody else were the playthings of the heavens. Human beings had little, really anything to give in the way of guiding history or the affairs of the world and the universe. We were the dregs. And of course, a totalitarian state would love to push that view. And when you get into that state, of course, when you get into that mindset, when that becomes all pervasive, and you see this during Stalin's reign and the Soviet period right up to the late 80s, people lose any interest in their individuality or in moral agency. It's easy to be a bad neighbour. It's easy to steal or to stab at your friend in the back, or to treat women and children as nothing. It's easy to see human life as having little dignity. And one of the things that stood out for Christians, particularly by the 2nd and 3rd century, is their care for children who had been put out on the street because they were the wrong gender. Maybe a child the family had hoped for a boy, but they got a girl, so take the baby and just dispose of it alive still. Most of these children died. In the catacombs, the Christians gave them a decent burial. And that's why in the catacombs there are thousands and thousands of little graves for babies. And there are all sorts of other incidences. When plague came, I think it's St. Cypriot who noted that the Romans, the elite, fled to the hills. The Christians stayed behind. And that gave them, particularly in the latter parts, in the sort of dying days of the empire, that gave them a certain kudos, because they were in a sense careless and reckless with their own lives. They were willing to walk the extra mile, to love enemies. And all this is derived from that great theology, that one idea that men and women are made in the image of God, as we are told in the book of Genesis, and that Christ, not Caesar, is the image of the Father. And in doing so, all of us, can you imagine how outrageous this would have been to have heard this in the 1st century? That all of us, through the Word made flesh, can become children of God. If we are prepared to immerse ourselves in his life, he will share his divinity with us. There's a moment in the Eucharist. There are secret prayers. Not everyone uses them, but I like to use them. They're little private prayers that the celebrant makes. And for the blessing of the cup before the start of the Eucharistic prayer, I take water and put a dribble of it in the wine. And the secret prayer is, by the mystery of this water and wine, may we come to share in the divinity of Christ, who humbled himself to share in our humanity. By our baptism, by our immersion in the life of God, by the gift of the Spirit, we are able to be children of God. And that's an extraordinary thing. And we should never let go of that. We should fight for that truth, in a sense, with all our energies.